I'd like to welcome you all to this very special conference, a conference which is born out of controversy, but yet at the same time, it's our purpose here to try and examine controversial issues in the most objective fashion that we possibly can. So the purpose then is both to inform and at the same time to learn from the experience of others, especially from our colleagues in the United States, about the topic of investigating war criminals today. With the new inquiry that's been announced, the issue is, what in fact should we do in Canada to legitimately pursue war criminals, but at the same time, can we avoid what some people feel to be the excesses that took place in the United States? So much then for the basic and realistic purposes of this conference. A modest effort, but I think at least it's a first step in this direction. May I just clear up some organizational problems at the same time. Many of you will see that the hall is very small. For this I take full responsibility, simply because I did not realize in the beginning that there would be such a great demand for people to come to hear us debate what are sometimes very academic issues. So if you feel tight or you feel warm or uncomfortable, you can always complain to me, because it's my fault. The response has been extraordinary and in fact very encouraging. I'd also like to announce that although the program is very exhaustive, you will probably be very exhausted yourself by the time 8:15 comes around. So what we've organized is a hot buffet and refreshments. Euphemistically, refreshments meaning a wine cash bar, which will be in the next room after the final session at 8:30. And if you'd like to buy the tickets, and we only have a few, about 350, you can do so at the registration desk. The price is $10 for the buffet and $2 for the wine. Let me also explain the format so that we're very clear right from the beginning. Because of the time constraints, the enormous amount of the topics that we have to cover, and the limited time, question periods will be very limited. We will try and have as many questions as possible. However, in order to be fair to everyone, the following format will be used. If you do have a question, you'll notice that in your registration kit you have sheets of paper, extra paper. Could you please write your questions down and sign them? Raise your hand, and someone from the floor, there'll be monitors everywhere, will come and give that question to me, and I will pose it publicly. This also is a practical constraint here, because we don't have the microphones available amongst you as well. So if you could just follow that format, we would appreciate this as well. So let's begin our first session, Pre-World War II Ukraine, a historical overview. The purpose of this session is to try and clarify what was happening in Eastern Europe before the Second World War, and if these events before the Second World War have any relationship to the events which follow. And both speakers today, in fact, argue that there is a fundamental link between the pre-World War situation and events during the Second World War, and even events in today's events in the world. Unfortunately, Professor Szporluk called me this morning. He has a very bad case of the flu, and his wife is also sick. So he asked me to express his regrets for not being able to come to the conference. However, he did give me his notes, or at least I will try and pass them off as his notes. I may be, in fact, distorting his comments altogether. But I'd like to present to you his arguments on the topic, the crisis of identity and legitimacy in the interwar period. For those of you interested in learning more about Professor Szporluk's approach, he tells me that his paper is going to be published in Slavic Review in a forthcoming issue, probably in the next issue. So, in fact, if I do not present the essence of it properly, you can check to make sure by reading Slavic Review in the next issue. His central thesis is the following. He argues that the countries or states of Eastern Europe and the USSR, where most Ukrainians lived, were based on several fundamental principles that not only determined the character of Eastern Europe in the interwar period, but also continue to shape contemporary events. The first principle which one has to come to terms with is one of ethnic or national specificity or exclusivity, whose most immediate cause was the turmoil of World War I and the subsequent creation of states along national or ethnic lines. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland are but a few illustrations of states created after the First World War and based on a conception of a dominant ethnic group, Poles being the dominant group in Poland, obviously, and a conception that the Poles themselves were the nation. Basically, other minorities did not fit into the scheme, be they Jews, Belarusians, or Ukrainians. And the other 25% of that Polish state was not really considered to be, if you like, first-class citizens of those states. So national antagonisms were a hallmark of these new and emerging states, which were conceived, as I've stated, in war and revolution. For example, how do we understand this attitude of the dominant groups? The poet laureate, the recent Nobel Prize winner, Milosz, wrote recently that in interwar Poland, Polish public opinion did not think of Jews, Belarusians, and Ukrainians as Polish citizens. These minorities were literally viewed as a separate and distinct group or groupings. Hence, the persecution of minorities, or at least the denial of their national rights, was a characteristic of many of the East European states. Not surprisingly, the national minorities themselves did not feel that they were citizens of their nation state. As equality was denied to them, they did not consider these states to be legitimate. It became a fundamental principle accepted by both the dominating national group or groups and by the oppositional national groups that there was no need to seriously cultivate the allegiance of the minority nationalities. They didn't even bother to seriously, in fact, if you like, co-opt the nationalities into their legitimate organs of state. Thus, there was a profound crisis of both legitimacy and identity in Eastern European states. Not without reason can we speak of interwar Eastern Europe as a continuation of war by other, more peaceful means. Deeply disillusioned with post-World War I settlements and feeling humiliated and powerless, a quiet but deadly war was waged in these East European states. Assassinations, revolutionary underground political parties were the norm. And when war did break out, it is not surprising that certain states simply collapsed. Having earlier failed to resolve the crisis of legitimacy and identity, these states saw the emergence of warring national tensions during the Second World War. In Poland, for example, the Armia Krajowa, or the Home Army, the people, of course, in the underground, fighting the occupation, did not consider Jews, Ukrainians, and Belarusians as even potential recruits. This, despite the fact that many Poles had claims to Ukrainian and Belarusian territory, some even to Kiev itself. But there was another actor at work. This was the Soviet Union, which represented the second principle which Professor Szporluk argues. Not only the national tensions and national states conception, but also the other principle common to pre-World War II Eastern Europe. This was the principle of the dictatorship of the proletariat and class conflict, represented by the USSR, both in idea and in principle, as espoused, of course, by an elitist and vanguardist Leninist party. Class war and conflict lay at the heart of this new state's existence. Revolution was for export, and the USSR also questioned the legitimacy of even Western states. The Cambridge group of students, for example, among them the future double agent Kim Philby, was but one of many who felt their allegiance lay in Moscow rather than with Whitehall or with the House of Commons. Internally, the Soviet Union was also fighting a class war against the peasantry. Collectivization, the famine, the war against the kulaks were obvious manifestations of this class war. But in time, and especially with Stalin's rise, the war was extended to national minorities. Not content with reversing national minority rights established earlier, in 1938 Stalin even resorted to destroying Ukrainian churches with the help of the Red Army. In essence, then, many elements in Soviet society also felt that they owed little allegiance to the regime. The crisis of legitimacy and identity in the Soviet Union was therefore very real, though less obvious to Western observers than the crisis in Eastern Europe, of which we've spoken about before. This brings us, says Professor Szporluk, to the matter of collaboration during the World War II period. Collaboration, he argues, implies belonging to a specific country, owing a certain allegiance to a state. The national minorities had very little allegiance to their states, as he argues and has tried to show, both in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, and in many cases did not even acknowledge the state's legitimacy. The dominant groups also assumed this to be the attitude among their own national minorities, not without reason that Stalin distrusted the Crimeans, the Tartars, and the Germans living in the Soviet Union, and other nationalities. The result of all of this conflict, both class and national, was the tragedy with which we are all familiar with today. World War II brought these tensions to the fore and resulted in a war against all. To understand the crisis of legitimacy and identity in interwar Eastern Europe is to understand the issues which are with us today and which is the focus of this conference. Thank you very much.